evening or early morning. I know we're busy, and I think this means that we are all just delighted to hear from Dr. Clark today. This talk is one of three on race, food, and the humanities that is organized by the Association for the Study of Food and Society, funded by the Mellon Foundation, and hosted by the Culinary Institute of America. I'm Beth Forrest. I'm a professor at the CIA and the secretary of the ASFS. And today I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Patricia Clark. She is professor of English and African American Studies at the State University of New York at Oswego. Dr. Clark recently served as Associate Dean and Interim Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Oswego. In fall 2021, she returned to her home department as Faculty and Director of Literary Studies in English and Creative Writing. She teaches 20th and 21st century African American and U.S. literature and culture. Her published and forthcoming work focuses on language, food writing, and orality in the U.S. African diaspora, specifically how gender, ethnicity, and national identities are understood through narratives about food practices and, more recently, sound. Her work has appeared in Callaloo, archiving estimate. Oh my! Why are you giving me these titles, Patricia?
You don't have to. You don't have to say it.
Oh my, anyway, and which looks at Shangas, sassafras, cypress, and indigo, stone canoe, as well, and in collections published by Routledge, in particular cookbooks, cuisines, and Black nationalisms, engendering global transformations, and looking for Edna in Edna Lewis at the table with an American original. So thank you, Dr. Clark, and I pass it over to you.
Thank you. And so my talk is titled Eating and Cooking Words, African American Literature and Transformative Practices. And I'm looking at words, eating and cooking, literally in the verbal sense, and also in terms of, what these words activate. And so just an outline of my presentation. I have an introduction and aims for this project. Again, this project is born out of teaching a particular text. I'm not in a food studies department. I'm in an English department, but I use my courses as opportunities and for talking about food in particular ways, specifically across the African diaspora and understanding African identities, African American identities through food, through language. And so I will give some examples from selected literature, the literature that I've used in classes that present a more nuanced way of understanding Black identities through food, and then some examples of student work in some of these classrooms. And I will conclude with some projects, how to do things with words. I had the opportunity to create larger platforms across the campus in my capacity as Associate Dean and Dean. And we were able to do some great projects, I think, across disciplines. And so a lot of this work that I've done, it's pre-pandemic. And so since we're back in the classroom, trying to relaunch some of the things that we've done, again, brings along its own challenges. So I certainly will welcome any questions or suggestions that folks have in terms of what you've done since the pandemic and some of the changes back to what some term as sort of normal campus operations, but again, they're far from that. So to begin, eating and cooking words in African American literature. My concern with literature or with language, one of the things that I encourage students to do as they're reading the works, to understand reading as active activity. So reading and activating the language of food in African American literature goes beyond the descriptive and more toward the performative. And so what I mean by this um, is this idea of words as um, representing both what I call the changing same, and uh, projections into the future. And the changing same to me is the ways in which we often hear these articulations and restatements of repositioning the past and the present. And so you have terms like, just to draw from another discipline, Michelle Alexander. I don't know if anyone is familiar with her work, the new Jim Crow, but you have again these sort of repositionings of language that look at the past and re-articulate the present. But I'm also concerned with the ways in which language is projected into the future, um, the neologisms, new colloquial language, speculative language uh, that offers new possibilities in terms of talking about Black food in literature. Uh, One of the growing interests that I've begun in my classroom is looking at Afrofuturistic text and more speculative fiction, to understand what the language of these texts offer in terms of understanding the future of talking about Black food. And so there's a greater concern here because I deal with students who are writing texts. Some are creative writers, some are literary studies scholars, and they're creating text and putting them out there in the public. Some have blogs, they publish their work, and it's part of this growing, uh, I would call, veritable lexicon of words that is captured by programs like Chat GPT and other generative AI platforms. And so if we think about how um, language, if we're talking about um, Black food the same way for time immemorial, those terms are going to be captured by these systems that are learning um, and creating these contexts. And so it seems that there's this sort of strange loop, if you will. I would call it a strange loop, where you have information that's being recirculated, but not really advancing anything that's new, or even looking at talking about Black food in a more nuanced way. So again, my concern is with the ways in which young writers, undergraduates, are creating content and really encouraging them to look at the language and be as innovative as possible. The other concern I have a number of students who are training to become teachers. And again, we know the challenges that young educators are facing in classrooms with boards and groups of parents and politicians who are determining what content uh, children should read. Um, and along with these challenges, again, I stress to the students to think about, again, the content that they're producing in the classroom when they're thinking about through their lesson plans. I don't teach the curricular instruction um, in that program, but I teach the content courses. And so, in thinking about content, again, to encourage ways in which we're not replicating the same language. And so, again, language is at the base here for this project and my teaching and my return to the classroom, just encouraging work, writing, teaching, and collaborative projects that use food and literature as catalysts for transformative practices. And so at the end of this presentation, I have a couple of examples of projects that we've launched. And again, most of the stuff is pre-pandemic, and of practices that are potentially transformative in ways that cut across disciplines. So some of the selected literature that I use, I don't know if anyone's familiar. There might be a few folks who are familiar with Ntozake Shange's novel, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. Her novel was published in 1982, I believe. But the story involves a mother and three daughters named Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. And it's about their the the young sisters. They're coming into womanhood while trying to maintain the traditions of their Southern Gullah roots. They live in South Carolina. The setting of the story is Charleston, South Carolina. And so among the traditions that they're trying to maintain as they're finding their way onto womanhood, Black womanhood, are music, dance, writing, and of course, cooking. And what's really fascinating and exciting about this book is that the recipes are included in the story, and the recipes actually interrupt and punctuate the continuous narrative of the novel. So you get the story, and then you get the recipes. And so the recipes obviously are included to invite readers to make the dishes and to attend family events. So the novel itself is quite participatory. So one of the examples of recipes in the book, we have the event of the Christmas breakfast. There are 3 recipes that are written wholesale in the novel: Hilda's turkey hash, catfish the way Albert liked it, and trio marmalade. And so these recipes are planted in the text. What's interesting about the recipes and how they're positioned, and of course they have the names of the creators. But the second recipe, catfish the way Albert liked it, Albert is the patriarch of the family who is absent in the family. And so his presence is articulated through this recipe. And so, of course, there are other stories that build around Albert's absence in this family of women. But again, as a reader, you get a chance to actually make the catfish recipe the way Albert liked it, and to think about, this idea of creating a presence in in light of an absence. And so there's throughout the novel, um, the mother and the sisters debate back and forth regarding the absence of the father. The sisters, the daughters, have a memory of their father being abusive to the mother. The mother, of course, has her own version of why Albert is not there. And so there are different versions in the novel, different uh, texts that are used to talk about his absence. And one in particular is the letter, Hilda's letter, the mother, Hilda, to her daughter Cyprus, who she admonishes her daughter not to go stirring around dry bones. Hilda admits that the father um, has left, but for reasons that the daughter might not understand. Um, and because her father was part of the island culture of the Gullah people, and the Gullah who inhabit the barrier islands off the coast of South Carolina, just off the coast of just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. The mother justifies again his absence, and so whether the accounts or the repressed memories of the daughters are the truth of what happened to the father, or if the mother, through her recipes and letters, um, decides to, again, create a presence that is not controversial, is left up to the reader to decide. But again, um, the the novel encourages students and readers to participate in determining the makeup of the family, of being a full participant of the what happens in the story. There's another portion to the recipes. The recipes are not just food recipes. We have the youngest daughter, Indigo, who is basically learning to be a conjure woman, and she has her conjuring recipes and spells included as well. And so there's a really great one um, where an example of the recipes that she uh, contributes to the story: the emergency care of wounds that cannot be seen. And again, the novel takes place in Charleston, South Carolina, in the 20th century. And again, it looks at what has happened to um, the diasporized folks who have then, grown and contributed to and worked um, throughout the 20th century beyond slavery. And so the emergency care of wounds that cannot be seen, um, Indigo's recipe, if you will, hold the victim gently, rock in the manner of a quiet sea, hum softly from your heart, repeat the victim's name with love, offer a brew of red sunflower to cleanse the victim's blood and spirit, fasting in silence for a time, refurbish the victim's awareness of her capacity to nourish and heal herself. New associations should be made with caution, more caring for herself. And so, again, these recipes and potions and um, are inserted in the novel wholesale and encourage readers to participate fully in the lives of the characters. So, no doubt, after Shange published this book in 1982 and 1997. She published a cookbook, if you will. It's a cookbook and a narrative titled "If I Can Cook, You Know God Can." And to offer up what she extends beyond her novel Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, um, she talks about how um, this how enslaved people were left without a language to communicate. And so food and recipes, preparing of food and a meal became the way in which all these enslaved folks who came from different regions of Africa that came to the Americas became their vehicle for communication. And so this brings a sort of, I think, a richer idea of what happened to um, folks across the diaspora, African um, folk who landed here in the Americas, and how we began to communicate through sharing meals without having a shared language. And so the meal becomes the language. And so there's a sort of reciprocal thing that happens with then understanding when um, over time folks began to learn how to write and read in the language of whatever country they landed in. If they landed, south of the border, or they landed in South America, the languages of Portuguese and Spanish. In North America, learning English and learning how to write. And so that writing was infused by the meals and the food that was created and cooked. So again, I see language as being sort of this reciprocal process in which communication was created, made, maintained throughout even today. So the next work that I'm looking at, and a book that uh, have taught is Alice Randall's book, The Wind Done Gone. The Wind Done Gone is the unauthorized parody of Gone with the Wind. What's fascinating about this book is that we're at a point in looking at the enslavement of Africans in the South, and the coming into literacy that happens during slavery, despite the prohibition against learning how to read and write. So, what Alice Randall imagines in this parody is a book that looks at the perspective of the mulatto child that is sired by um, Gerald O'Hara in Gone with the Wind and Mammy. And so the narrator of the book, who is actually writing her diary, the book is actually cast as a recovered diary of the mulatto child that was sired by um, Planter and Mammy. Randall gives Gerald O'Hara's another name in her work. And so the novel is thick with all these food references, and so much so that one wonders, because if you've read Gone with the Wind is a 1,000-page novel. Um, there's not, I mean, there's a barbecue, there's feasting and all of that, but it's not really um, rife with food references. But Alice Randall does the opposite. She, in looking at and rereading and recasting um, the social relationships between the Black enslaved folks at Terra, um, she she invests them with, you know, a sort of agency. They know how to read, and or they learn how to read and write. Some of the enslaved, um, particularly Sonara, who is the mulatto child sired by Mammy and Planter. Um, but there's also the sense in which um, she looks at the labor, the actual labor that happens at the plantation. And so there are just a wealth of food references in this novel. So Sonara, the main character, has the nickname Cinnamon. Mammy is considered, has a nickname Coffee. And this is the planter's sort of way of talking about his mixed sire. You know, Mammy is the coffee to um, Sonara's cinnamon, which makes reference to the fact that, you know, the different, not just the different flavors or different foodstuffs, but also, you know, the color of coffee and the color of cinnamon, which um, is also referenced in this really interesting use of Black vernacular speech, in which miscegenation is referred to as the broth too rich for potato white blood. So the mixed blood is not just, you know, cast as coffee diluted with milk, but again, the sort of rich language that Randall deploys that complicates what it means to be in this particular moment in history, and especially hearing from and reading the diary of the mixed child, which again, we don't get that perspective in Gone with the Wind at all. Randall also takes liberty with changing other names. Like I mentioned, Gerald O'Hara in Gone with the Wind is called Planter. Um, I mean, clearly he plants a seed as well as being the overseer of the plantation. But their Planter's valet, um, Gerald, in Gone with the Wind, Gerald O'Hara's valet is called Pork. But in Randall's novel, she changes his name to Garlic. And so the difference between garlic and pork is pretty profound. Um, and it's interesting that she uses an allium to depict um, uh, the valet's character in her novel versus pork, which is, you know, again, registers as, you know, sort of typical or stereotypical Black cuisine. So you get, again, this sort of nuanced and different sort of seasoning, if you will, of what the characters bring to the table. She infuses her garlic with great agency throughout the novel, and Garlic declares himself, you know, after the war, um, the true owner of the plantation. And so again, you get a sort of different rendering of you know, these sort of names um, and terms of speech that give, I think, greater nuance to uh, the politics of the South during this period, and certainly a very scathing commentary on Gone with the Wind and its the way in which it heralds the South. So um, so much so that uh, Randall was. It took her a few years to publish this book because she was brought to court by the estate of um, Margaret Mitchell, who was the author of Gone with the Wind, um, claiming plagiarism and other things, other violations, copyright violations. And so it's really quite interesting and I invite you to read, um, you know, at least portions of Gone with the Wind, but to read Randall's novel to see what she actually does and the commentary that she actually brings forth. And again, so we're talking about language that um, contest some of the stereotypical ideas about food, about the people who prepare the food, the people who are um, sort of cast in these sort of stereotypical ways. And so looking at the language to think about, you know, miscegenation as, a broth too rich for potato water blood, and to think about a building barbecue. A building barbecue is the moment when Atlanta was burning down. And so again, these references to food and to the actual historical moments that were happening in historically in the novels. So there's a companion book. In reading this some years ago, the book was published in 2001. Um, I thought because there was such a plethora of food references that surely Alice Randall must be writing a cookbook. And sure enough, she does come out with one with her daughter, and the companion book, as I call it, the cookbook Soul Food Love: Healthy Recipes Inspired by 100 Years of Cooking in a Black Family. Um, she claimed that she wanted to be the last fat Black woman in her family. And again, the way that she terms it, sort of borders on this idea of fat shaming. But the idea behind what she wants to convey is so specific to her family, but yet enjoined to a past that you don't get, again, the typical rhetoric of fat shaming in this book. So, and she's really concerned about the future and how the future is articulated through food and through what she calls her own family's kitchen migrations. And so she has so she states for us the path to our Black food future runs through our Black food past, and it requires radical change. And of course, that radical change necessarily includes, again, a look at the language that we use and the ways in which, if we want to affect change, that somehow our language has to evidence, that change. And so she comes up with, again, a number of terms that I think are useful to look at in terms of how to cast food in the future, and especially how to look at one's past in light of what one might imagine the future to be. She came up with this term that I thought was really interesting, the term kitchen rape, to talk about a particular incident or event in her family's history. And of course, many Black families have the story of an ancestor, generations removed, um, who might have been raped by a landowner, the person who enslaved them. There are a lot of stories like that. But again, to think about the how deep the trauma is, she came up with this term that she thinks um, really merits, she said, merits the coining of a phrase so that the atrocity might be better mourned. And she traces again, the idea of these women who were an ancestor who basically were affected by the potato broth blood, how that again went through the kitchen migrations that her family experience and that she charts in her book. So recently I've began looking at adding to, again, this repertoire of works in novels that we talk about in our classroom, um, and how they not so much just represent food, but the way in which language itself um, activates a different way of thinking about history, the history associated with women in the kitchen, generations of women who passed down recipes from one generation to the next. Uh, I began to think about, okay, so what is it that we're projecting into the future? And also playing into um, students' growing interest in Afrofuturism. And so a lot of this is new. Um, some of the texts are not so new, but certainly the growing trend and interest in Afrofuturism certainly merits some attention, especially the ways in which food is articulated. And food is often articulated in a fantastic way, specifically in N.K. Jemison's work. She's got two great stories where in her short story collection, How Long Till Black Future Month, and both stories look at the the ways in which we can take um, imagined ingredients and concoct something that evokes a past that has the effect to work out some magic in the present to make for a better future. Um, so there's this sort of I look at it as Sankofa, these recipes as embedding something like, the spirit of Sankofa, in that there's a sense in which the past is still being evoked, but there's a look toward the future in terms of what can be understood. So the second story that I list here under the collection, La Camista, the main character comes into a restaurant with an ingredient and challenges the chef to cook a meal with this ingredient that she has no idea what it is. And so the story ends with, of course, she cooks the successful dish, um, and the dish transforms the gentleman and makes him younger. And so there's a sense in which, again, um, these stories invite uh, the idea that some sort of future or projection of a future can be had or imagined through these stories. Um, Also, I've used Octavia Butler, her work. Many are probably familiar with her work. She's been a long time. Um, the late Octavia Butler has been a long time award-winning speculative fiction, science fiction writer. Her work, Kindred, um, and Parable of the Sower, her trilogy, Lilith's Brood, all deal with issues of sustainability. Kindred, interestingly, there are these scenes in which the protagonist or the main character, Dana, goes back and forth in time during slavery, and she lands in the kitchen. And so the ways in which she lands in the kitchen, she's time traveling from 1975 back into the 19th century and going into these 19th century kitchens to do work with these women. Um, and so the way in which she communes with them, again, is sort of an exemplar to the ways in which one might imagine writing the sort of way of understanding the past and to articulate not only what is possible, but again, some of the dangers in going back to the past and um, tr- you know trying not to trip over the things that um, we don't want to repeat from the past. And um, so there's a lot of tension in the book, in the novel, and it's a great novel to talk about and to teach because it presents this idea of, how do you recover the past? How do you write it to go forward in a way such that, you're not necessarily, well, you can't undo the past, but how do you write it forward? And so my explorations into Afrofuturism with students have been primarily positive, and it offers, again, yet another lens to think about these these works and how they relate to the ways in which food is articulated in literature. And so I have this quote from Isaiah Lavender, his Afrofuturism Rising, the literary prehistory of a movement, again, where he talks about the ways in which um, it's certainly effective as um, a narrative practice that enables the users to communicate the interconnection between science, technology, and race across centuries, continents, and cultures. And to go back to what I had stated in the beginning when I talked about uses of language and some of the aims that are really concerning for me in looking at technologies like Chat GPT and all these other generative AI platforms that just take content and you know it's dumped into these systems, and the machine learns how to use and to manipulate the context. But if we don't infuse the networks, if you will, with a different kind of context, different language, again, we might see replications of some of the same stuff that we're trying to undo. Um, and so again, there's a sort of urgency from my standpoint, in terms of looking at language in a more nuanced way. So there's some student projects out of this. And so there were some in courses that I've taught, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, of course, poster and slideshow presentations. And we've actually had students try some of the recipes in the book and had potlucks. Some of the recipes were interesting. Some of the recipes I think were not um, uh, checked, and so some of the ingredients, the measurements were kind of off if you followed the recipe faithfully, but some were good, and it was a great experiment to try the recipes as we were reading the work. Um, Also, the learning more about Gullah culture and the cuisine, and of course, living in upstate New York, we don't get those fresh ingredients here, but there was great interest in learning, about gumbo, the ingredients of gumbo, and learning about okra and everything else that is characteristic of Carolina Low Country cooking in the book. And in some of these classes, I paired the reading of the book with Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust, which has these magnificent scenes of um, cooking gumbo, cooking the food of the Low Country, so they could actually see what it looked like, beyond imagining what the food looked and possibly taste like in sassafras, cypress, and indigo. And then finally, we had a couple of really large collaborative projects that I was involved in, including what we called our Grand Challenges project, because the campus is situated on Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes. We chose as one of our challenges the theme Fresh Water for All, and focused on water. And at the time, the Grand Challenge took place, was a 3-year project, from 2019 through 2021. So we kind of were caught up in the middle of the pandemic, but were able to actually do some projects. And one of the projects I did was I constructed a course that looked at water and the color. I called it The Color of Water. At the time, the Flint, Michigan water crisis was going on, and so that was big in the news. And so here is, I don't know if I can click on this. Oh. I don't know if I can unshare this, but well, I won't interrupt this, but I have a document that I wanted to show. What the project entailed was writing narratives that were going to be captured in a web program that was written by another group of students in another class. The class that was in charge of the technology um, were charged with creating QR codes to link the work that my students did in the class based on water. So we read literature that was based on water, poetry, like Langston Hughes' poem, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." We read James McBride's the uh, "The Color of Water," and we read text on folks who were affected by segregation. um, Cleveland Sellers' memoir, A River of No Return, and talked about the ways in which water was cast in the during the Jim Crow era to present day, and how that became a sort of continuing issue. Um, and since we were connected to the Great Lakes, we wanted, especially the students who lived in the dorms that were lakeside, to as they were looking over the beautiful view of the lake, to think about all these again representations of water and what water means across different contexts, and specifically in terms of Black people, and how access to fresh water in the 21st century certainly became a crisis. Um, and so that was one of the projects. I was hoping I would be able to show the document, but I can't get the technology to cooperate. Maybe I can do it at some point. But at the end, so we had the Grand Challenges project of Oswego, Freshwater for All. And there were a number of disciplines that joined in to create these projects. And it was part of a greater um, project that bloomed into the Problem Pedagogy project that I think Beth, you linked that to my abstract. And so again, all this is available and you can look at it online. But that's what I have. And so if anyone has any questions.
Yes, I think most people are muted because of the webinar format. But if you see the chat or the Q&A option on the top, you can certainly drop in your question there or your comment, and I can read those to Dr. Clark. We have only a couple minutes, but I'm
Oh boy,
sure.
I'm sorry.
No, no, it was fascinating. I think you've all given us wonderful reading lists for the next several months, so certainly appreciate that. I do have a question. So as a professor who really thinks about reading as an active activity, I'm wondering, do you introduce or teach your students to read differently cookbooks or recipes as opposed to fiction and literature, or do you see, or should the student or us approach these in the same way?
I think it's great to read both. I think I read recipes as a type of narrative. And so, and if you think about the different narrative styles of fiction, um, there's ways in which certain styles of fiction um, certainly take on the features of a recipe. And so I have students read both side by side, and I would encourage folks to read text side by side. And I think Sean Gay, when she I think brilliantly inserted recipes in her novel, you know, had this idea as well, to look at again writing and the possibilities of writing and um, what can be considered writing even.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions? I know our time is technically up at this moment. Um, well, again, for those of you who are going to ASFS in Syracuse, Dr. Clark is there, and I'm sure there will be a gaggle of us surrounding her to ask follow-up questions as we think about all of the great topics that you've introduced to us today, as well as many of the great resources to think about adding to our classroom and our curriculum. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Clark. For those who are interested, our third and final talk in the lecture series is May 6th with Dr. Meredith Abarca, and her topic is Your Voice, Your Story, Backyard History as Acts of Justice. So I'll be sending out that. And I'm not sure if you saw, Patricia, but several people have thanked you in the chat. So you can't perhaps hear them, but they certainly are putting that in. So thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day as we move through the week. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you.